So at this point, we've talked about bacterial antibiotic resistance, but how do we actually know when bacteria are resistant to an antibiotic? Ooh, good question. It's me, Moser, and after watching this video, you should be able to identify the primary method used by scientists to test for antibiotic resistance in bacteria. You should also be able to analyze the results of antibiotic sensitivity tests and make a few inferences about the history of use of antibiotics. It would be just dandy if you already knew what antibiotic resistance was and how it's caused. Okay, let's get started. So remember that antibiotic resistance is when bacteria suddenly are unharmed by antibiotics. And this is some scary stuff. Multiple species of bacteria exhibit resistance to one or more antibiotics. As a matter of fact, there are some species of bacteria, some strains of some species, that are resistant to all known antibiotics. Ooh, that's bad. So how do we determine whether or not an individual bacteria or an individual colony of bacteria are resistant to antibiotics? Well, most commonly it's done using something called a Kirby Bauer test. And a Kirby Bauer test is actually fairly simple. You've got a petri dish with agar in it. You have little paper discs that are soaked in antibiotic, and you have bacterial growth. So this petri dish has been sort of seeded or planted, we actually call it inoculated, with a particular bacteria, and these little antibiotic discs have been placed on the surface. Where the bacteria is growing, and it's a little hard to see, but it's actually this hazy area here. It's sometimes called the bacterial lawn, as silly as that sounds. The bacteria is doing just fine. Where you see the color of the agar clearly through the bacterial, when there's no bacterial lawn, that is an area where no bacteria is growing due to the presence of the antibiotic. Aha! That area where no bacteria grows around the antibiotic disc is called the zone of inhibition. Zoe! Yeah, exactly. To inhibit is to restrain or to hold back, and the zone of inhibition is the area where an antibiotic holds back the bacterial growth. Now, you might think it's as simple as saying, oh yeah, hey, there's a zone of inhibition there. We're good. Or, hey, there's no zone of inhibition there. Ooh, that's a bad thing. Well, it is. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. To interpret a Kirby Bauer test, you need one of these. Because every antibiotic travels a different distance through the agar. So you need to know how far we should expect to see it traveling and how far out it should be keeping the bacteria at bay. Okay. So now, armed with an agar plate that has been prepared with antibiotic discs and inoculated with the bacteria have been allowed to grow, and of course, we've got our trusty ruler that measures in millimeters. We are ready to do some measuring. Well, it's been done for you. So the diameter of the zone of inhibition for each of these antibiotics has already been measured. Are we done? No, of course not. Remember that we need a table that tells us how far that antibiotic is going to travel through the agar. And we'll start by interpreting one of these together. We're going to look at antibiotic A. And for antibiotic A, we see, and this is antibiotic A right here, that if the zone of inhibition is less than or equal to 15 millimeters, we would consider the bacteria to be resistant to antibiotic A. Well, the zone of inhibition here is 21 millimeters. Well, that puts it squarely in the sensitive category. So for antibiotic A, we can say that this bacterial species, whatever it is sensitive to the antibiotic. Okay, great. Now, let's look at antibiotic B. We found the zone of inhibition for antibiotic B, and it measures 16 millimeters. Now, if we look at the table, we notice that if the zone of inhibition is less than or equal to 17 millimeters, we would consider that the bacteria is resistant to antibiotic B. So therefore, what do we say about this species of bacteria? We're just calling it bacteria X for now. Based on the results of this Kirby Bauer test, we would say that bacteria X is in fact resistant to antibiotic B. You get the hang of this? Let's do two more together. Here's the disc for antibiotic C, and we note that the zone of inhibition has been measured at 18 millimeters. If we look at the table, we see that for antibiotic C, well, less than or equal to 13 millimeters would be resistant. 14 to 15 would be considered intermediate resistance. Aha! Greater than or equal to 16 millimeters, antibiotic C is still sensitive to the effects of this antibiotic. Let's look at one last one together. Here is the zone of inhibition for antibiotic D, and it's been measured at 19 millimeters. Now, if we look at the chart, a zone of inhibition of 18 millimeters or less would mean that we would consider this bacteria to be resistant to this antibiotic. A zone of inhibition of 19 to 21 millimeters, however, gives us a new category. It says that this bacteria is considered to be intermediately resistant to the antibiotic. What does that mean? Well, intermediate just means that the bacteria is starting to show resistance to this antibiotic. It's not completely resistant, but it certainly won't be killed completely or quickly using this antibiotic. Well, what does this mean in real life? The big takeaway here is that if you have an infection caused by bacteria X, you don't want your doctor to prescribe you antibiotic B. You probably don't really want to use antibiotic D unless you have to. If you've got an infection caused by this bacteria, if it's possible, you would want to use antibiotics A or C because they're going to do a better job treating the infection. Good. What does this mean about those antibiotics themselves? Okay, so the bacteria is sensitive to a particular antibiotic or resistant to it or starting to show resistance. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, but commonly antibiotics that have been in use a long time, that have an extensive history of use, that are commonly prescribed, well, bacteria tend to be resistant to. So this is a Kirby Bauer plate, and, we've got our little table here. We're not even going to look at it. We know, without doing any measurement, that all of these antibiotics are having some effect on the bacteria around them. Maybe not much, we don't know what the table says, but there's one here that really stands out, and that's this guy. Yikes! The zone of inhibition is 0. The bacteria here completely runs right over the antibiotic disc. What does that mean? This is very likely to be an old antibiotic or a commonly prescribed antibiotic, something that bacteria have had lots of exposure to, because remember, how do bacteria get resistant to an antibiotic? Through exposure. All right, let's look at our goals. Can you identify the Kirby Bauer test as the most common test used by biologists and medical professionals to test for antibiotic resistance? Good. Can you analyze the results of a Kirby Bauer test using a table and an agar plate? And can you make a little bit of an inference about the history of use of antibiotics? Good. I thought you could. All right, on with your work.